Batu, Barada, Nikto.
You must remember those words.
Gordon's alive.
You know what the Turing test is?
I know Kung Fu.
Dead or alive, you are coming with me.
My God, it's full of stars.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Stories Out of Time and Space. I'm your regular host, Scott Weatherly, and as always, I am joined by Julian Darius. Julian, how are you doing?
I'm doing quite well, considering I was recently revived from 50 years ago. A man out of time. How about you?
Yeah, or a vaudevillian comedian at a time, I think we'll find. I'm not bad, but from this moment forward, I will be referred to as SW81, because apparently names are gauche, and we're all numbers now, past 1980. Yeah, we are kicking off season 4 of Stories Out of Time and Space. We are kicking off with a mega list, and if you go back to the last episode, which is a bonus episode, we listed out all the films that we are going to do, and also that's all going to be all. It'll have been on social media. Go check out our Twitter account and everything else to see all the films that we are going to be doing this season. It's a whole year worth of films, and we are going to cover about 90 years. In fact, I think it is, because it goes from 1930 to 2020. So we are going to be covering 90 years of cinema history. And there'll be some more denser periods, I think. But also we're targeting some sequels and some remakes and all that sort of thing. So we have got an absolute span of diverse science fiction for you on this fantastic season. And we are starting early doors, really early in the history of cinema. We are starting in 1930 with now sit with me on this one, science fiction comedy musical romance that is Just Imagine. It is called Just Imagine, directed by David Butler. We'll go for this, but yeah. So let me just. Well, no. In fact, do you know what, Julian? I'm going to push it onto you. You, it's your choice. Right? Let's give me a plot summary, or give me a summary of this film.
Okay. Well, after briefly being introduced to the world to 1880, and then seeing 1930 when this film was released, you jump over to 50 years in the future, all the way to 1980, where J21 is the main character, and he's in love with LN18, because, as you say, everyone has letters and numbers for names. And you have to apply for a marriage application. The woman has to consent, so it's not just like
that's debatable. We'll talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, there definitely is some gender stuff going on here. But apparently, while J21, before she met him, her parents supported him getting married to MT3, who is sort of a conceited, sort of rich guy type. So J21 is lamenting that the court has decided MT3 is the best match, and he's hanging out with his buddy RT42. And they attend a man being revived from the distant past of 1930 after he died being struck by lightning. The man is revived and becomes known as Single O. Yeah. And they meet Z4, who is a scientist, and Z4 says, I'm planning a rocket ship to Mars, and I could use a pilot because J21 is a pilot. So J21 goes on a 4-month trip to Mars in order to return and be present for the appeal hearing, where he will be awarded the girl by the court.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll talk about some of this stuff. And along the way, so this is true. Like basically, this film, this film, it sort of covers. You literally get images from 1880 straight through to 1930, and this imaginary future of 1980, which we will talk about. Along the way, you get a slight ballad about sort of loving someone and how sort of like someone is the melody and someone is the words. And then you also get a song about swatting flies. This film was a flop when it came out in 1930. And it's one of those where like, I'm not gonna just diss on this film for an hour and a half. That's not what I'm gonna do, because there are some interesting points in this, and it's quite fun. But however, even if this was ever made, like, who is this for? Like, as an audience member, like it's so all over the place. I was like, I don't know who this is targeted at.
Yeah, first of all, let me just come out and say I kind of love this movie. This is it is so charming to me. I mean, the musical numbers are a little hit or miss. In fact, I think the strangest thing about envisioning 1980 is like we're gonna go right on with those crooning songs. Like it's so absurd. Like and I love like 30s music, but imagining it's still going to be just the same instead of like Johnny Rotten or something is, utterly absurd. But, you have this wonderful Mars sequence with, a queen and, all this elaborate costuming. You have these models of the city. I mean, and you said, who does this appeal to? Okay, well, it is a musical. It is a comedy. But it's also a really big budget movie. I mean, this was a big budget science fiction movie. This is like, Star Wars or in, 1930. This is like, we talked about John Carter previously, and that was a flop too. But I mean, the goal is we're going to take you on a wild adventure. We're going to, there's going to be song and dance numbers. It's got a little something for everyone. And you're going to see just amazing stuff. And I think it delivers on that.
It does on the spectacle. And there's some fascinating ideas. And I agree with you that this is charming. I really do. I think there's some elements of this that are wonderfully well thought out. And there's other elements that are just sort of absolutely crazy. And one of the things I will say is that this film, obviously, was clearly like made and released in 1930, and with that comes a certain societal baggage that it carries. And there's a couple of things that this film made me think about actually, and one of them I came across a quote from Arthur C. Clarke. I couldn't find out what year he said this, but he said many films that present a vision of the future have an idea that the year in which that film was made carries on pretty much unchanged for the period of time until the film is predicting, so because you can't predict like those world-changing events that will actually redirect history and stuff. So you almost have to assume there's a status quo. Now, I think that's changed a little bit in more modern filmmaking. I think we add in. We're so used to now sort of these world-changing events, we sort of add things in and go, okay, well, I think, even if you look at like Blade Runner or even Star Trek, they introduce things like, oh, we've had these wars, that's what changed the direction of history. But this film is very much like, what happened if 1930 just became cooler for the next 50 years? And part of me is like, yeah, I would take some of that because it looks awesome. It has that Art Deco-y sort of futurism that's really cool. So that's one part of it that I like. The other part is I like the fact that sort of off the back of that is, and we do it as well, we look at technology. When you look at a science fiction film, like technology is a big part of that, where the innovations, and the innovations come from whatever's in vogue or whatever at that time. And it's quite clear that air travel was a big part of 1930. And I love how that becomes a big part of this film. I thought some of the concepts for those individual planes is brilliant. Like I love them. So that's an interesting sort of thing I like, just from this sort of this thing of vision of the future. But it also made me then think of all the other films that we have passed. Like you laughed and said about 1980.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, yeah, there's no there's no punks, there's no sort of like, Black Sabbath, there's no Black Sabbath coming out, there's been no sort of Beatles, whatever. But it did then make me think of all those films that we've already sort of talked about that have this vision of the future, sort of Back to the Future 2 with 2015, and or even sort of like more close ones, like similar to this, Demolition Man, where it has this vision of the future, or even we've passed Blade Runner 2019. Even the dystopian ones have this slight optimism of how fast certain technologies and things are going to grow. We can't seem to stop ourselves, and then we get to that year and you go, yeah, we don't have hoverboards or replicants or all this other stuff. So that I was just fascinated by watching that how sort of like it. But television communications. I want to talk about that as well. But television communication always seems to come up in all of these, which is fascinating. But that was just something that sort of this idea of like future visions. I find really interesting.
Yeah, I had some of the same thoughts. And I was thinking about the Back to the Future 2 parallel. I mean, and you think about what is required to get some of these technologies off the ground.
Yeah.
I mean, for replicants, you need a massive bioengineering program that just like perfected, created. I mean, it's gone through making robots, presumably, and then has just made them increasingly organic until they're essentially indistinguishable from a normal human being. I mean, but also I grew up on like 2001 and then like 2010. Yeah, we don't have manned flights to Jupiter yet. That did seem realistic, but no. So I think one of the key takeaways of that, and I don't know that this is any, any more off than some of those other predictions.
Oh God, no. No.
Obviously, like Blade Runner, there's been a nuclear war in the background, and most of these buildings are unoccupied, and and it also looks at like the Japanese, concern of the 1980s,
exactly.
Right,
That's the thing. Like that's the accentuation. Yes.
Yeah, and so I don't know that this is any more off, but to get to your point, what we underestimate, we sort of overestimate technology, except in the areas where we do get it, right? So like on Star Trek, there's still, like it's a big deal that they have like iPads, they invented the iPad basically, and it's like, right, around the year 2400, we'll get the iPad, well, we beat that, but we still don't have the flying cars. So, I mean, it's interesting the way that technology advances, but it's also massively interesting the way we underestimate social change.
Yes.
That, technological change happens slowly. Social change, I mean, relatively speaking, we've had more technological change. You think about what life was like 100 years ago, I mean, this is almost 100 years old. I mean, it's flabbergasting, I mean, most of this country isn't even electrified yet, So, I mean, it's just absolutely flabbergasting to think of. But in a human life, it seems to come relatively slowly. But then, in 1980, obviously this movie can't anticipate, rock and roll. It can't anticipate, feminism. I mean, it can't anticipate, it imagines food being pills, which we've seen in other stuff, right?
Yeah.
Like that'll be much more efficient. We'll just take these super vitamins. But then, I mean, like it doesn't imagine like, oh yeah, by the way, we're going to have regulation on that because like in 1930, they're still serving, most meat is sawdust and in contamination.
Yeah. Well, I do want to explore that because one of the things I'm interested about this is you say this is a science fiction film. This is let's call it a blockbuster of its day. Okay, it's aiming for that big sort of ideas. Sort of. But the theme of this film is interesting as well. Like the film breaks up into two parts because there's two films here. Like there's literally like you could break this into two bits and literally have two films. there's the romance story of someone who's trying to prove their worth in this modern, in this future society of like you have to have contributed something to the society or be shown to be contributing to the society to then sort of be able to have these ideal matches. Because MT3 owns a paper. He's a publisher. That's what he does. And so he is seen as being contributing because he has this newspaper. So he's able to. That's why he's preferred over J21. So this mission that J21 chooses to go on as a pilot to Mars is so that he can actually elevate himself up through these contributions to society. That's the point. That in itself is a film. You can go with all the social struggles. You can do all this other stuff. It made me think of things like Gattaca that we've covered in the past. That's a film in and of itself. And I kind of like some of the stuff in there. There's some great sort of ideas in there. That Romeo and Juliet kind of sort of like unrequited love or whatever, lot of star-crossed lovers kind of thing. Then you've got this other story, this guy out of time that's revived from 1930 and 1980, this sort of fish out of water comedy that is also its film in and of itself. And I'm like, wow, I've just sort of smashed these two ideas together, and it's baffling and kind of fun at the same time. And so I have to sort of take them apart, sort of put them together, because they have different themes. The whole thing about this love thing is about, there's this story that they have this idea that sort of touches on it, because they talk about being, this idea of being perfectly matching the words and a harmony together, and they have all this other stuff, and this idea of don't shit under someone else's love, like don't swat a fly because that fly has a wife and kids, and
it may love some other fly.
Yeah, exactly. And so when she's drumming on that set sofa, and they have a whole section of choreographed fly swatting, that notched this film up at least a star for me. I was like, that's going up to another level. Because the girl who does that, she plays D6 is her name, and she sort of appears in something like Marjorie White. She's great in this film. She's actually really cool. And so there's all that sort of stuff about this. This thing about sort of do what it takes to be sort of but it's not in that thing. And this is I want to focus on that for a moment, because again, looking at it in its context, this is someone working within the system. His mission is to work within the system to elevate himself so that he can get the girl, right? To acquire the love story. There's no rebellion there. There's no sort of thing. If this was a modern story, let's sort of say, I don't know, last 30, 40, maybe even 50 years, let's still call it 50 years, not, the story would be about how he rebels against the system, and how they'd be showing how bad the system is, like 1984 style, of how corrupt it is, or how constrained it is, and that would be the story. They would end up together in some other way that way. So it felt interesting that it felt very conservative in its values of we're going to work within the system to make this work. I'm not big enough to shake it down. I'm going to work within the system, which I thought was really interesting for a protagonist.
Yeah. I mean, it's worth keeping in mind that this is, about 10 years off of the Red Scare.
Oh, yeah.
The first Red Scare, in which, anarchists and, Italians, frankly, and just, immigrants are being rounded up and deported, and, just absolutely having their constitutional rights trampled on. So, there is clearly a sort of rejection of the role of government in deciding these marriages. The film wants you to, think that that's bad, but it's not going to present a revolution movie, right?
No.
Because it's not a Bolshevik movie, which is, what that might have been seen at the time. And there is a kind of, I would say, quietism to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a sort of American, right, we wouldn't like this, but also we are not going to have a revolution over this. And in some ways, I think that is more realistic. I mean, you mentioned Gattaca, and in the same way, it's more of a social critique. obviously. I mean, even Blade Runner, you're supposed to feel like it's terrible that these replicants are treated this way, right? You're supposed to condemn the law more. But, so it is strange that that's sort of lacking. But at the same time, I kind of like that people, first of all, it's just who you marry. And, I mean, my question is sort of, this makes sense for New York and for a certain upper crust. This is
Yes.
never going to be implemented in the sticks, right? There's no like Indiana judge going like, all right, T32,
Yeah.
no, you just can't do this for every single marriage. So this is clearly a sort of like upper crust kind of thing. But also, by the rules of this film, her family kind of pressured her into it,
Mm.
but she did agree to marry this guy, and then agree to this other, well, not agree to marry him, she agreed to this, to accept a proposal. And the
Yes.
idea is that, a court then decides. So there is a sort of like, there was concern during the first Red Scare about how a lot of the propaganda was focused on how, and this is funny now, but how under the Bolsheviks, women had been communized and were like commodities that were being, traded and given to men against their will. So there is a sort of like air of that. But at the same time, she still has to agree to the proposal, just that she regrets this one. And she says when they're on the airplanes, that she hadn't met J21 yet. And that's the one line of dialogue to explain it.
Yeah. Because
you're right. There's no revolution, right? There's no,
and that I think that's very much more of a modern thing. Like you said, that's what I'm saying. I'll take this in the historical context of the period it's in, because there's one sort of like, there's a minor character. You get very few peripheral characters to give you a view of the wider world. You get odds and sods, so you get Z4, like you said, but you also get this census taker that comes round and basically forces her way into the apartment. And I kind of like this because I actually really like RT42, because he's sort of like the cheeky one. He's the sort of like delinquent of the two, and he is kind of charming and he is quite fun. But she actually says, they talk about the whole thing of marriage comes up, because she says about who lives here, what are you male or female, and they talk about the dog as well, which never comes back again. It leaves for 4 months.
Yeah, it's just a joke that his name is K9, right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. But she says about the fact that, like, basically, like you say about that women have to accept the proposal, but they can't make a proposal.
Yes, that's right.
And so women, so basically this census taker is sort of, lamenting the fact that like no one's ever made a proposal to her. Mm-hmm. And RT is very much sort of like, oh, that's a shocker. Like, you must be, fun at parties. And he's sort of mean to her, but like obviously in a jovial way. But like, there is that glimpse of, again, this thing of accepting one's role. Like, she's like, yeah, well, I've never been proposed. I've never received a proposal, but I've still got to do my duty. I'm the census taker, sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So there's little glimpses of a wider world, but it is clear how I don't want to get into the sexism just yet, but how male centric this world is.
Yeah, I mean, it's fundamentally patriarchal.
Yeah.
I mean, I thought that line was also key, and it's strange that like that's a feminist line, right? Like, I should have equal rights. So, why is it the expectation, especially in the 1930s, that a man is the one who asks a woman out? A man is the one who asks a woman to dance. Back in the day, that was a big deal. And, honey, wanna go to the soda fountain with me? And there are vestiges of that today, but it's mostly gone. But I mean, that is a sort of feminist line. But at the same time, you sort of see how nobody really questions it. And And even the main woman, Ellen, which I think is mildly clever. Ellen, 18. She sort of objects to, like, well, why can't I make this decision myself or whatever. But I mean, and I often think about this sort of like, in the context of like the flappers of the 20s or something, who were proto-feminists, right? Um, obviously this was a completely sexist, bizarre from our standpoint society. And you have these women who are questioning it, but who still go along with it in other ways.
Yeah. When you say they question it, they're not, like you say, this goes back to it's not being a revolutionary movie. It's not about that. And so questioning it, I don't get questioning it is too strong a word. There's a sort of, like you say, there's an air of not so much manipulating the system, but like you see Ellen and Dee sort of being as friends, how they sort of like, get around MT3, like, oh, she's got a headache, and she just starts there sort of like patting her on the head, like, she's poorly, this is terrible, you go out and enjoy. You're not like, women have got, this please excuse the language, but like their wily ways of, because that's what this film is. It's sort of like, women have got their wily ways of getting around these things, and it's got that. However, there is also a song quite early on about having a girl from like the good old days.
Oh yeah,
almost like grandma used to be, which is a little creepy in and of itself, but like it talks to, and it goes through a series of sort of images.
Yes.
Of women in different positions, and there's a dancer or the one that is clearly presented to be potentially a flapper, but then there's a woman reading a book while she's while she's sort of like pushing a crib and sort of bits. And there's even in this, there's this idea of, well, I'm not looking for a feisty woman of spirit and who knows what. I'm looking for an old-fashioned woman who, and it goes back to this idea of sort of like, this is, you said about this idea of social change. This is a film set in 1930, made in 1930, set in 1980, about someone from 1930 saying, I wish I had like you say, almost saying, I wish I had someone from 1880. Do you know what I mean? And so that song in and of itself sort of felt interesting. I was like, okay, this is really sort of the what I'm quite comfortable that Jay likes Ellen, and they are in love, and they're well, and they've got chemistry, and it all works fine. But what he wants from her is really unclear. Like, this idea of, we work together, but I want you to be almost subservient to me in this sort of old-fashioned way, is his true desire. And so it's interesting how that sits even within this film.
I think that's true, and I want to explore that more. But I want to first say that I don't know that we're immune from that. Certainly it's less so than it used to be in the past. But I think of the Clintons, where Hillary was as smart or clearly smarter than her husband, but it was just expected that a woman puts her career on hold first, and that made a certain kind of sense because the man, was likely to, I say the man as if this is just totally heteronormative, but this film is as well. But I mean, the man of a heterosexual couple could have more income, right? So I mean, it does make sense, but of course that's also self-perpetuating. So yeah, I mean, I don't know that and I still see that happening today to a lesser degree, but it still does happen. And some of it is, frankly, to my mind, that especially men in their 20s are more narcissistic than women in their 20s, and a little more insistent on wanting that. But in that sequence of sort of the good old days. Now, I mean, I don't think of it as going back to the 1880s. I think of it as, it's also sort of like buttering up the audiences, right?
Oh,
like, 1930, like we're on the cutting edge of modernity, and in the future we'll progress, but we were when it was just right.
Yes.
This absurdity. And especially now there is something very Trumpian about imagining this golden age of the past, when women were women and men were men and all the characters were white and nobody made a big deal out of it. That does rile me, but I don't feel that about this film. I mean, it's 1930. It's hard for me to get worked up about. But in that sequence where they're showing all of these, old timey women, and I love the use of montage throughout this movie. It's wonderful. But in that sequence, the most alarming moment is a moment where a man is, presumably in 1930, is kissing a woman, and he goes to kiss this woman who clearly is saying no, and she raises her arm sort of, as he's kissing her, going, no, 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 no. And it goes on for 15, 20 seconds or something. And then she finally relents and puts them on his shoulders mildly. It's not like she's,
Yeah, she's probably been suffocated. I think he's used his face to suffocate her. I think more than anything. She's passed out.
And of course, today we think, oh my God, it's non-consensual.
Yeah.
But there is this old-timey attitude of sort of women are programmed to resist, and it's your job to push on, and sometimes no doesn't really mean no. And he's not raping her, right? I mean, I don't mean to.
But we don't know what goes beyond the 15, 20 seconds. God knows. But yes,
that's true. But also, it's not clear. I mean, consent is complicated and fraught, but she seems to really change her mind. But I mean, obviously, she's being held captive, basically. I mean, it's terrible. I think that is the part that's dated so poorly. But to bring it back to that context, I mean, probably, even women in 1930, even American women in 1930, would have predominantly said, listen, sometimes we change our minds, and I have changed my mind about guys, and right, that culture of press on would have been not just something guys said to each other, but something that women also agreed with, just because it was part of that culture.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, that's the thing. Actually, it's one of the things I wanted to sort of touch on because of the sort of the third act of this film, like this idea of culture, and what's accepted and what's the norm and stuff. But this idea, this weird nostalgia this film has, though. It's not nostalgia. You're right. It's not a nostalgia. It's this weird sort of promotion of 1930. Because I want to go to the other side of things then, just for a brief second. I want to talk about Single Zero or Single O, played by L. Brendel, who was a vaudevillian comedian, and he actually gets to do one of his acts in this film with the hats, which again I kind of enjoy seeing that kind of thing. There's a real charm to seeing that sort of stage performance and stuff. It made me think of Robin Williams. It's the kind of thing I can imagine, that sort of switching characters and stuff very quickly, being like Billy Crystal or Robin Williams or something like that doing. But this idea, the film itself starts with images of the three different eras. And so you get this sort of image of 1880. This sort of this Fifth Avenue, this sort of quiet street. It looks like a quiet street. There's horses and carriages, and they say, "Oh, how quiet it is! How safe it is! Look, this guy, he's crossing the street, almost gets hit by a horse, but no, he's safe." To jump to 1930, this is where they didn't have the traffic problems and all this other stuff we have now. And I'm like, well, you wait. Because then it jumps to this guy and he says, "Oh, look at this guy jaywalking," and he almost gets hit by a car. Oh, he's safe. No, he isn't. And it cuts to black. And then it sort of says, and now and that's the whole point of the film. Just imagine 50 years from now, there's these into gaps. And it jumps to 1980, and as you say, the sort of I think it must be like those painted backgrounds and all this other stuff. But like this idea of everyone's in these planes and they've got traffic control for planes and this other stuff. The vision of that though is great. Like I love it. Like that first thing of the planes, and I love the fact that one of the things I love most about this film is such a small detail, but it impressed me so much. Really, was someone had considered this idea of the plane. So they have got this propeller that takes them forwards, but then built into their wings, they have other propellers in order for them to hover and to help them land. Like someone had thought to engineer, like they hadn't just gone, no one's going to think about this. Who cares? They had actually sort of thought this through of what's almost like, granted it wouldn't work. I don't think it would work physically, but like what would be the logistics of a future vehicle and how it would work? So that the fact it has hover propellers, I loved it. That really worked for me. But then this idea where they can hover next to each other and he can sort of J21 comes along to her plane and they have this conversation. And they're like in the air, they're like hovering. Like I don't know how far up they are, but he sort of hops across onto her plane. And the policeman's like, "You can only park there for 3 minutes," and all that I thought was fantastic. I thought it was really interesting. I thought, they're really pushing into this futurism, this idea that there's going to be sort of like this techno-futurism and all this other stuff. And it's great, okay, brilliant. But then they do introduce this revived character, and he becomes the sort of like the point of view character in order sort of like, we need someone who can get all the exposition of what this stuff is. So let's introduce this character. And again, we've had these things, I think of sort of like California Man or sort of, it's called something else in the States, but these ideas of the unfrozen caveman or whatever, even Demolition Man, this Man Out of Time, Captain America. And so they have this character. Now he's a comedian and we'll get to that. I find it fascinating of like how swiftly they introduce him. Oh, he's been revived. Yay. And even the scientist is like, well, I'm done with you now. Like, we're not going to test you or anything. You're just done.
I do like that. I mean, it's certainly too fast. I mean, you think they would run more tests, and I wonder how he gets his identity papers, But yeah, I do sort of like that. Oh yeah, no, we're done with you. It's like a story where they revive somebody from cryonics, and they're like, great, well, we proved we can do that. Good luck in this new world.
yeah, like coming out of prison, like here's $10, bye. But they obviously the guys pick him up, and as they're walking through, they introduce those things that sort of, as you said, the food in pills, alcohol in pills, and there's a couple of things there, but he has this sort of running joke of going sort of like because he has this weird sort of he's the silly foreigner. It's the trope of the silly foreigner gag, but he's like, "Oh, give me the good old days," kind of thing again and again. And it's when he sort of sees the food, and he talks about how you'd see the thick cut steak and you'd taste the gravy and all this other stuff, which is quite interesting. And then he talks about drinking, because there is still 50 years later, prohibition is still in place, and they make the joke where he says, "Oh, well, next year we'll have light wines and beers," and they're going. He says, "Like, are they still saying that?"
Yeah, right.
And then they see a couple go to basically a vending machine to pay and have a baby delivered. And then he's like, "Would you like a boy or a girl?" And a proper baby comes down the chute, which I loved. I'm like, I don't know who's doing that on the other side. Like, there's some sort of, effects guy, some producer just like, "Go,
put the baby in now."
Yes, yeah. Go down the little chute. And he looks at that and goes again, like, "Give me the good old days." There's still this thing of, although they're trying to sort of show this future as being sort of like there's the efficiencies, like you said, the food and this thing and the marriage and all these other things, right? There's still this sort of idea, like you said, of like, but we got it right in 1930. You can still enjoy your food. You can still go and copulate with your women. You can still do whatever. All that's still there. And obviously they're going to joke about prohibition, which seemed interesting. But it does harken back to that thing you're saying of, it's not so much nostalgia, although it feels like nostalgia to us because we're looking back at the past, but it's that promotion of the now, which I find really interesting. And that character sort of acts in that part that whole section is literally just going sort of like, well, 1930 was pretty damn good. That I find really interesting. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Well, I mean, I do like this, and I do think that the baby thing, makes me think, how in the world does this work? I mean, in the same way that the marriage rules are a bit bizarre. I find myself thinking, how do you implement this social program? But having said that, I like this idea of sort of, right, we're all going to get old and look back on the time we grew up and said, that's when things were right.
Yes.
That's when the music was good, people made sense. And, there is that sort of presentism that goes beyond just praising the 1930s and becomes more a wider recognition of, yeah, this is how it works, right? Those people from 1880 are still saying that today, in 1930. And, 1930, if you run forward, and we see that today with the 1950 stuff and, people saying, right,
And the 80s.
in my day, men were men and women were women, and we didn't have trans people. Not pretty sure you did. You just weren't aware.
You
there
just didn't see
weren't
them.
as many terms, right?
Mm.
But it's like, in my day, we didn't have homosexuals. Yeah, you absolutely did.
Yeah.
You just believe that you didn't because you didn't encounter them. And there wasn't, so much racial strife, right? Because, there were no blacks couldn't find employment. So you didn't, and they were red lines to other neighborhoods. So, but I do think there is a way in which this film not necessarily knows that, but it doesn't take itself so seriously. Like, if you want to see this in the 1930s as like, right, we got it right, you absolutely can.
Yes.
On the other hand, there is a way in which it's not pointing to anything specific that's all that meaningful about 1930. It just seems to be, as cultures change, as technology changes, everybody is going to be the amusing, Swedish. I mean, there was a Swedish immigrant type, right? I find this amusing. Like, that was a whole type in vaudeville, right?
Yeah.
Like, wow, I'm the Swedish immigrant, who can't pronounce his J's. He pronounces them as Y's. I mean, it's so, first of all, we don't even find ethnic stereotype characters acceptable today. But,
but
within
that's...
white, quote unquote, white society, there were all these white ethnicities that were considered, we're not so sure about them,
That only died out recently, though. I mean, that thing of doing sort of like, even in the 80s, what was the Russian one? In my country, sort of right. Like all that stuff was still going on. Well, it's only been the last 10 years, which really probably sort of like hit home, even to the extent of like, well, these black or Mexican or ethnic cartoon characters really should be voiced by someone of that ethnicity, not just a sort of like a white guy that can do a lot of good voices. And so it's interesting, but like vaudeville, I do want to talk about vaudeville and that type of humor as we get into it. But it is interesting how you're right. It does sort of tread a really fine line, and it does it quite well, of being celebratory of 1930 by being, slightly critical of these sort of things in the future, but whilst showing them as relatively wondrous. Look at these advancements and stuff. And again, this difference in storytelling and where this thing's focusing, like, is interesting because, and what the expectations of a story like this film is focusing on Jay. That's the point. J21 right. is the focus. His relationship with Ellen, fine, but someone who gets revived after 50 years and then looks at the future, doesn't then usually would be like, how the hell did we get here? Why have you called? Why are you called J21? At what point did that go? Did they say, yeah, Julian and Scott, names, we're dropping those. You're now going to be called something else. Or what was the purpose? Like, they're the kind of things that, in a film, if this was made now, you'd have that discussion where you'd be like, well, it happened because of this and stuff. And there's other drop lines that when the census woman comes in again into the apartment earlier in the film, she asks RT about his parents. What about your mother and father? And he says, "Oh, I'm a test tube baby."
Mm-hmm.
But both I and J are of the so they we don't have parents. And he names a company like Western Electric or something like that as being there, which I kind of like. This is again like quite funny. But again, like, all right, so they've actually invented a way of to propagate without. So is that cloning? Is it like did they or is it that he doesn't know who the people are? Like I don't know. And so there's no explanation of some of these things of how they came about. It's just, so you're sort of just led to accept them, which I'm fine with. I don't want a detailed history. But this comes back to this thing we said before about there's no like world-changing event where they're like, well, this happened. There was a world war, ironically, and we took these kind of like measures. It's just sort of like these are just things for the future, like the Jetsons. Like we're going to have these things in place. So yeah,
Well,
but they're there to be wondrous.
I mean, it's interesting to me that Single O is sort of you're saying that he's sort of the revival and that there are multiple plots kind of shoehorned together. I don't know that I disagree with that, but it's funny. Demolition Man has the sidekick, comedic, character.
Yeah.
I mean, the Stallone Judge Dredd does. There are an awful lot of sci-fi that we grew up with that have that kind of character, and apparently Ed Brendel was kind of like a big star briefly. He was like at the time.
Yes, his name's all over the poster. Like, he's one of the big names on the poster. Yeah.
So it's sort of featuring the SNL guy who you will totally forget in 5 years.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I did. Go ahead.
No, what were you gonna say? You go.
Well, I wanted to change the subject just slightly because you were talking about this vision of the future, and when you cut to 1980, and you were talking about like the sort of matte painting and how the design of those planes were cool. Okay, so first of all, this is not a matte painting. They built a giant miniature of that city with 250-story skyscrapers, suspension bridges connecting them. This miniature cost $168,000 in 1930. They built it in an army balloon hangar. It took 205 technicians 5 months to build it, and it had 15,000 light bulbs just in the city, not even counting the lights in the rafters.
Yeah.
So I mean, they reused it.
I should hope so.
Yeah, and they reused that like the rocket ship that got to Mars. But I mean, like, no, that's actually a physical model,
and that's really impressive. To know that is really impressive.
Okay, then when you have the like planes, right? When you're talking about how they're designed. And I think it is that city that's kind of most remembered, from this movie. But when you have those planes and you're talking about how cool, and of course it's sort of, a few years later it would be jets, right? But they still have propellers, right? But they also have the VTOL propellers. And I think it's so funny that there's a cop in a like suspended little like it's so like the 1930s. Like, well, of course you need a traffic cop at every major intersection.
Not just a traffic cop; he's an Irish traffic cop as well.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Very obviously, because it's New York. Yeah, I mean, it's absurd. But when you have all of these images of like the background of the city, of course today it'd be done with green screen. I thought, oh well, I'm familiar with rear projection, where they project the image behind the actors and then film that. The real projection did not exist in 1930.
Wow.
And so the way they got all of that and composited images was they had to shoot the background and then take the actual developed film
and paste it on
and paste it on to the film as they're filming the actor, so that so that film gets that imprint gets onto the undeveloped film, and you're trying to run 2 film strips through the projector.
Yeah.
And this is, look, this is 1930, and they got that.
Wow, that's really impressive to know. Like, because it looks good. Like, it looks good. Like, for the time, it looks really well done. And I also appreciate now why it's not, there's not loads of shots of them walking across some of the suspension. Like, no, these shots are enough, and we'll just use it in other films to sort of cover the cost.
Right, especially after it was a flop.
Yeah.
And finally, one other thing about this is that electrical equipment that's used to revive Ed Bredell as Single O used the following year in Frankenstein, directed by James Whale.
I thought so. I was going to look into that because I was looking at this and going, especially the thing that sort of like pulses down and stuff. I was like, that looks incredibly familiar.
Mm-hmm.
And I was going to wonder if some of that stuff was used again.
And if I remember correctly, that starts for this film, goes into Frankenstein, and then winds up being used in the actual props were used in Young Frankenstein by Mel Brooks.
Yeah.
Like in the 1970s, they're shooting a comedy based on a film that was reusing that prop from this thing.
That's quite impressive. So yeah, I mean, this film has got a legacy then that, unknown more for its visual effects than say its plot. That's really impressive. I mean, that's sort of, and I would say that about the sets. I actually want to say about some of the sets in this as well. Some of them are a little sparse. The apartment. Again, this is not a knock. Like, their apartment is relatively sparse, but the courtroom is relatively sparse when they go for the appeal and all this other stuff. However, it's quite clear they knew where to put their money, because they've done obviously the big sets and stuff for the backgrounds and for the models. But then when they go to like the girls' apartment and stuff, like, they've put more money there, and it's subtle, but there's a nice contrast between this sort of relatively sparse, not so much bland, but very male apartment that the two guys, RT and Jay, live in. And then you go to Ellen and Dee's place, and it's very different, and it's very feminine. They've got sort of like, this sort of chaise lounge, and they've got the nice beds, and it's got more like Art Deco wall decoration and all this other stuff. It's got like a balcony. And I actually kind of like some of the subtle set design like that actually shows sort of like, those differences between characters and stuff that may or may not be intended, but it works well. And so I liked some of that. And also wealth. It shows sort of this difference between wealth. Like, the RT and J are supposed to be pretty poor. Like, they're low on the social ladder. And obviously she's now sort of like, linked with MT3, who's got more money. And her family's got more money because that's where the whole thing's set up. And so I like the visuals in some of those as well. I was sort of noting were quite cool. So that sort of, like I say, I think some of the visual and the production design in this is actually really good. I think they've actually put some thought into it. Again, like to say, the planes, this is an idea of like the way these planes come in is they slow down and then they use a hover to come to the ground. Like, I was like, cool. That won't be used in a jet plane until like the Harrier jump jet and stuff until like the 60s. So brilliant. Some of the other stuff I was quite impressed with. Like, they have that television technology. Now, this is one of the things I wanted to sort of just bring up, because some of the technology is fun, and I want to get to some comparisons later on. You and I are sat on. I'm sat on a laptop. Sat on a laptop. We're now talking across, the Atlantic. There's that sort of, we're able to do that. But I still have to send you a call for you to accept, or vice versa. I was quite intrigued that RT is able to go, well, I'll call D and find out. And basically presses a button and her apartment just pops up on his screen. And she's sat there in her lingerie on the bed. And he's like, oh, shame. And she runs off and gets something. And I was just like, it's clearly for a joke and stuff. But I was still like, for everything else you've done where you've thought things through, this seems really weird that you literally can just pop up in somebody else's apartment or somebody else's house on a video screen. It seems really bizarre. But
why does it seem bizarre? Just that it's so
well, she doesn't accept the call. Like she literally just turns on, and she's like, "Oh my god!" Like she's surprised that the call
Yeah,
has
she's
gone
basically
through.
being spied on. I mean, that is
Yeah,
another sort of like weird gender moment, right?
yeah,
Like, haha, you know. But there is a line of dialogue to explain that where, you know, he just sort of opens the window. You know, there's a sort of vertical
yeah.
shield that raises, and she's on the TV. Um, and there is, I think she has a line of dialogue where she says, "Oh, I forgot to turn it off when we last talked."
Right,
So apparently, you know, there's just it's just like
an
I've
open
left the
channel.
Skype connection open, and you're
Right.
like, right, I'm gonna check in on Julian. Oh, here he is lounging on his couch. You
Yeah,
know.
yeah. But again, like I say, all those things sort of work well for this film. It comes to the charm of it, and I'm going to say the charm for the first two acts. I do want to talk about this. There's one thing again. I'm sort of there's one thing I wanted to throw in because we talked about the time before we get to the finale and we get to the big bit. This film was made in 1930, and we're not far off the transition from silent to talkies, as it were. And you can sort of see there are some actors in this that really seem to struggle with a natural delivery. There's some that seem fine. Again, I will call out the woman who plays D6, Marjorie White, and even actually Maureen O'Sullivan, the main characters and stuff, and the guy and Frank Albertson, RT42, are all great. Like they seem quite comfortable with it. They have a relatively sort of naturalistic delivery for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a point at the end actually, which I'll talk about when we get to the appeal, and D is giving this sort of faux story about MT3 about she sort of like how she impregnated him and so he impregnated her and he should be marrying her and all this other stuff. And then like when the judge starts challenging on it, she's like, "Well, I didn't really, I didn't say it under oath," and she's been like
Mm-hmm.
coy and cheeky, and I think she's very good. Al Brendel though, who plays Single O,
Mm-hmm.
John Garrick at times who plays J21, but particularly Kenneth Thompson who's MT3, really clearly comes from a different era.
Mm-hmm.
Because their delivery is so stilted, and like really sort of like they're not confident about how their voice should sound in this new medium. And it's weird because El Brendel's clearly like he's a vaudeville, he's a stage performer, but there's so many times where his sort of delivery is so stilted and sort of like he's not sure. And there's a great one at the end as well. The guy who plays Single O's son when that turns up.
Mm-hmm.
Like he's obviously an old guy they brought in to do whatever. Can't stop looking at the camera. Like, there's twice where he sort of like
yeah.
flicks up at the camera. But that's besides the point. But I don't know. It just felt like again. I was like, this feels like a transitional film. Like there's people in this that have been in silent films, and there's films that there's those that are coming through on talkies, and I can feel that different style of acting, sort of like almost at odds between some of these performers. Did you know?
Yeah.
You know, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that is true. I mean, I don't know that this is a transitory film. I think this was a pioneering film. I mean, in its failure, this was a big budget science fiction film, the likes of which we have now. I mean, this was Dune. This was crazy ambitious, and its failure really ended, except for Serial's big budget, Hollywood sci-fi. I think what you're pointing out is true, and of course on stage, especially back then, I mean, actors really had to exaggerate, right?
Yes.
And so actors who came in this period and in previous decades from a stage background would wildly exaggerate because they've got to see you in the back row, right? So, and stuff that works on stage in a way that it doesn't in film. And so I think we're much more comfortable with tiny shots, close-ups today. Obviously, this is not a close-up movie. The close-up massively overused today, to the point where it's such a cliche, such an easy answer for things. But but we're used to much more subtle acting and subtle displays of character and emotion. But it does get to the era and sort of like what is entertaining. And I think that you see these miniatures, you see, I mean, we'll talk about Mars in a moment. You see these, massive sets and whatnot, and they're still impressive today. I mean, certainly if they had been recorded in, digital HD, it would look even better. But those are really awesome. There's stuff that's really awesome here. But then there's also vaudeville, right? There's also these musical numbers, and some of these numbers are pretty good. Some of them are, okay. That silly fly song, right? Where like don't swat a fly, and it goes through all these different, and then you see the fly sort of cuddling together, But I mean, it's funny. Like each of them is annoyed by the fly, and the other one has to stop him. Like remember, we're singing a song about don't do the thing you're literally just doing. That was actually a number that went on to have life from this film. It's not the best number, but I do think some of the numbers are okay. But one of the numbers that is worth pointing out is the drinking song. As these men are sitting around and drinking. I am a huge fan, huge fan of Bugsy Berkeley movies. And I love that sense of spectacle. And you have several numbers in this that are clearly Bugsy Berkeley ripoffs. As the lines of women are dancing and they go through each other and intersect, and the camera is up above them as they merge and sort of almost swim across the stage. All of that is just pure Bugsy Berkeley. And the drinking song is super stupid. I mean, it's not about anything except that's the downside of musicals are, these numbers that are like, let's just throw in a number here, do you like plants? Yes, I like plants. It's like not relevant to the plot. But I do love that sense of spectacle. And I think that certain elements, like some of the dad jokes, especially around Single O and the, sort of Swedish immigrant type, and the vaudeville stuff it's cool to see him doing the different hats, but it doesn't wow us the way it might have wowed them back then. At the same time, that sense of spectacle wows me so much more than it probably would have at the time, where we just don't do stuff like that anymore. And it uses the human body. The coordination of the human body and that character, going through everybody as they're holding their steins up, across the table. I mean, it's fantastic. And it brings me so much joy, even in this silly, second-rate ripoff.
Well, you talk about the music because we haven't talked about Mars, but there's one of those sort of like big dance numbers on Mars when you see all those sort of people dancing. And I was quite impressed. And that also has a major set as well, which we'll get to. But what that drinking song as well, and actually the one on Mars. You're right that these things aren't commonplace anymore, and they're so uncommon that when they are done in something now, they get highlighted as the greatest dance number that's in that film, or as they get pointed out in some sort of great, oh man, look, you've got to see the choreography in this. Like, we get the odd one, like when they redo a sort of a Broadway show as a film, Les Mis, Chicago, something like that. But the ones, weirdly, the two that actually, that drinking song in particular made me think of, I don't know if you've seen Rocket Man, which is the Elton John biography. For some reason, it brought that back. And I think there's a couple of songs in that have that sort of sense of feel. But then also you say about that sort of vaudeville dance number, again, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, which is 84, I think. It has that thing, doesn't it, at the beginning with Willie Scott when she does it in the club. And even in 1984, to open a film with that, was people were like, oh, this is, it opens with a real spectacle dance number, like Spielberg sort of throwing in, the kitchen sink to this. And you go, not really, compared to these things that were being done 50 years before. Even like you say, in this sort of like this sort of kind of rip-off version. So you're right. It is interesting to see. I'm always impressed with choreographed dance numbers because I'm not that coordinated, and to see these people do that is really impressive. So I do find them fun. But you're right to see that they stand out probably more now because of that, because they're just not in favour. They're not the thing to do. But they are pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, and the training and the costuming and so much of the long takes where it's like, wow, this is one take, or a few shots, is really impressive. And I think I love everything you just said, and I think it's right that even where it's not a major part of the plot, where maybe in a present day movie you're introduced to like, right here we're at the hotel, and you see the line of women in some sort of headpiece or bathing suit, sort of jumping one by one into the pool.
Mm-hmm.
Bugsley Berkeley invented that shot.
Oh,
that shot
okay.
was done, literally done 100 years ago now.
Yeah.
And it's a fantastic shot. It always works, but you'll see a movie that does that, and granted, it's in color, it's in high definition, it looks great, but you'll see that shot, and it'll get mentioned as like, oh wow, that's really impressive, and it's like a 20th generation shot that was done way better as like one little moment in a like 15-minute long astounding thing of overhead mirror shots of women swimming across the pool, and clearly this has that influence, and for me those moments are divine.
Yeah, and they are impressive and they are quite cool. Let's move to Mars though, because I do want, because
I can't wait to move to Mars.
Yeah. Get your ass to Mars.
Get off this planet. I want off.
The rocket, again, like you say, and I'm not going to sort of like kick on their technology ideas for this, because obviously they didn't have jet engines and all other stuff, so I'm not going to harp on that. But they get on a rocket, because even so, like the sparseness of the inside of the rocket, like again, I can think of like the Quatermass experiment is very similar. That's only sort of 30 years from now, or even 20 something years. But yeah, the rocket goes up. The one thing I thought was interesting, like I said, there are no creature comforts. It takes a month for them to get to Mars. Now, again, I'm not going to talk about how long it actually would take, that long. But that's fine. But I kind of like that they acknowledge the passing of time.
Mm-hmm.
That it's not just sort of like, boom, we're there. That they are like, oh no, it would take time. Like it's a distant place.
Right.
And so
yeah, I mean, there's a 4-month window, and
yes,
they're really only on Mars for like there is a 4-day period on Mars, but they're maybe on Mars for like a week. The rest is traveling time. Like
yeah. And so they acknowledge that, which I thought was kind of interesting. This idea that like, because the point of the mission is just to get there and get back. Mm-hmm. Like that's the point. And that's the sort of what J21 wants to have, this sort of thing to elevate him to be like, I'm the first man to Mars. And so they do this, but they travel there and it's good. And obviously, Single O is a stowaway, not knowing where they're going. So and that's that's one of the weird moments when they tell him. It takes him a beat to respond, and then he goes, you tell me now, and sort of collapses in that sort of like over-exaggerated way. And then they laugh, and you're just sort of like, no, like I'm going like, how much fuel do you have? Like, can you carry this extra person? It's not a consideration. It doesn't matter. But one of the things I do like is there's two things I kind of find interesting. This idea of Martians and what they are, but also the fact that because this is a black and white film in 1930. But they give it a red color tint for Mars.
Now that was added later.
Oh, was it? I wasn't sure.
That was added later. Yeah.
It was good to see the difference, though. I liked it. For me, it was a bit worked. I was like, oh, they're a Mars. That's cool. But what are your thoughts? Go on, hit us with your thoughts on the whole Mars section then, because it's interesting.
As the writer of Martian comics.
Yes, exactly.
Plug. Yeah, I mean, first of all, to get to your point about, I thought the same thing about the stowaway, but also like did you guys bring a change of clothes? Where's
Or
the
any
showers
food.
on this thing? They're in the same clothes through the whole time. It's like those are pretty rank after 4 months. Yeah, I mean, I love the Martian stuff. I mean, and of course, Mars is breathable and it has, a culture. And it's sort of ruled by a queen, which is cool. Interesting sort of take on, we've been talking about gender roles and, it's a matriarchy. But, and great costumes and all of this. But there are apparently everyone on Mars are twins. And so there's, the good queen and the bad queen, and clearly played by the same actor.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think it looks great. It's, it's a little silly, but I mean, we talk about on the Patreon for Stories Out of Time and Space and 20th Century Geek, we talk about the Twilight Zone. And the Twilight Zone has stuff like this,
Yes.
More than 30 years later. So this is obviously a long time before, the Viking probe, showed Mars is probably pretty lifeless.
Yeah, but and I'm quite again comfortable with this idea of sort of like our interpretation of our solar system in 1930. That there's a population on Mars. But I like this. Yeah, I like this idea of having the sort of the yin and yang. Like everyone is a twin. There's a good one and a bad one, and they have separated into two societies, like two mirroring societies. Almost like a mirrorverse. Like one side should probably all be wearing goatees. But I like the fact as well the way they sort of depict some of this. And again, we talked about the vaudeville, but like the pantomime and the acting of this, the big acting of the Queen and her sort of like protector or whatever. She keeps just sort of like doing that sort of like raising and hissing and like kind of thing. All fun. But I like the fact, like I say, some of the sets. But when they're introducing the good side, there's like an entrance way. And like a tiered sort of wall, and everyone's leaning over the side and cheering them and clapping for them. And then when they get taken to the bad side, that same entrance exists, but everyone is jeering and shouting and threatening them. And I like sort of this sort of, again, some simple things, but I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. That's a funny idea. But there's a whole section of this because the Martians don't speak. It's all done through sort of gestures and other bits and pieces. So there's a whole
de facto sign language. Like,
yeah,
I mean, it's cool that they know, like, the Martians don't speak English, and that they try to communicate, and you have the characters trying to puzzle out what that means. I mean, it's cool they at least get that idea right.
Yeah, they're not all going to speak English, like But also, I have to say, like, there's a bit where they're with the goods and they're putting on some sort of display. There's like a dance number and stuff going on, and then the bads attack. And I must have missed them because I watched it and I was like, "Is there any explanation as to why this is happening, or is it just happening?"
It just chose them to attack, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
it's fortuitous. I didn't know because I was thinking, like, do they indicate that they've seen the ship land and they're sort of coming because of that, or is there something else that's triggered it? I don't know.
They probably heard. I mean, there is a guy who's clearly one of the sort of male spiky outfit guys who runs away from, and it's a lovely set as the rocket ship lands, sort of the miniature. And it's not clear which tribe he belongs to, but then later on they go and they have to choose, do we go left or right? And they flip a coin, and that leads them to the good guys.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, it doesn't make sense why now, but
no, I was just wondering if I'd missed something, if there was an explanation, but if there isn't, I'm not that bothered. But I do like all this stuff again on Mars. One thing I would say is it lasts a bit longer than it needs to. I mean, it definitely feels of sort of like the Flash Gordon serials or the Buck Rogers sort of serials, and that's all kind of cool. But it does sort of go on, and I think one of the problems I have with this point is where the vaudeville sort of gets a bit tedious. So the character of El Brendel or Single O, he continues to have these sort of moments where he's like he faints or he's like, oh my, and sort of like, or he gets into a sort of a tussle and he'll get bopped on the head and then he'll collapse or he'll stagger. And you've said about this being a rip-off, or this being a blockbuster, but then sort of like taking others. He was brought in because he's a name, and you made a really good point about, he's like the SNL the actor that sort of like, you'll have forgotten 5 years from now, sort of, the Will Sasso of sort of like, goes off and does a film. And all I could think of is, this guy on his own. Yeah, there's others, but like, it felt like this is the kind of thing that like the Marx Brothers or Laurel and Hardy do 10 times better.
Mm-hmm.
That sort of like comedy, sort of vaudeville timing and sort of like that pantomime of being hit on the head, reacting, spinning around and doing stuff. And I went off actually, and I went to sort of check, and I thought I'm interested to just watch a couple of those. And I've seen quite a bit of Laurel and Hardy and stuff, and I've seen a bit of Marx Brothers, but I went and had a quick look on YouTube. And I was like, yeah, do you know what? They are good. They are really good. They're very rehearsed. They're very well done, especially when you watch some of their films and stuff. And there's a reason, I think, that those stand up, and obviously they're teams and stuff. But there's a reason that they stood up as classics, or they stand up as a sort of, iconic from that sort of transition from vaudeville to screen. And this guy probably doesn't. And so I just thought that was interesting. Sort of like he does his bit, and he's got this, like I said, this foreigner character, but like his timing never feels as spot on or as crisp as some of those other acts, and so it feeds again into that thing of like, yeah, he's popular now, but like they're not getting the top notch comedian or that, because again, it's probably a cost. I'm pretty sure even in 1930, like Laurel and Hardy probably cost a fortune to hire or something. There's two of them, so I don't know, but it just starts sort of like wear on me a little bit. I was like, okay, this is still going. I'm still doing this whole thing of running around on Mars. But
yeah, I mean, I keep thinking about Rob Schneider. Like,
yes,
right? Like he's hot. Let's put him in this, and it's like,
yeah.
Oh man, like, I mean, to his credit, Ed Brendel is more talented than Rob Schneider. Okay, and,
yeah.
And also the vaudeville acts, can, especially the hat number and stuff, have a charm to them and are kind of cool. But you're right, too much time is given to that Rob Schneider character who they think is going to be a big hit with the audience. And, in retrospect, is not that impressive, either a talent or those jokes, don't land compared to other stuff. I don't know that the Mars section is too long. I do have some of the same feeling that, like, especially with the Al Brendel stuff, that I was bored with, some of that. And I thought that this movie moved at a rapid clip. I mean, we've watched a lot of movies, not a lot, it's a minority, but we've watched several movies for this podcast where I'll sort of, stop in the middle and think, wow, like I've got another hour to go or something.
Yeah.
Never felt that way here. I mean, I was on for the ride. But during the Mars sequence, it does. So I do sort of think, well, I mean, I find myself thinking two things. One is it's dragging a little, but also I'm thinking, how the hell are they going to get back and wrap this up in like 10 minutes, Yeah. And I sort of feel like the Mars stuff should be longer. I feel like, but it should feel like there's more going on. It should be more entertaining than it is. I love the costumes. I love the dance numbers. I love the twin thing, as you said, the confidence and paranoia kind of thing.
Yes, yeah.
And I know you love those internal conflicts. I don't know how they're, like divided. I mean, do these tribes have an agreement? Like, right, you figure out when people are born who's the good one and who's the baddie.
Maybe
send them off.
Yeah, maybe they don't have goatees when we see them, but maybe that's how they're born. Like the angry ones are born with like thick eyebrows and a goatee. Like, oh, there's the bad one. That goes off to that village.
Well, you mentioned the eyebrows. Like they have the sort of Spock Vulcan eyebrows, which is clearly just absolutely the early Vulcan eyebrows.
Yes. Yeah, I love the design. Even like I say, going back, this goes back to that production design again. Like the production design on this stuff is great. Like you said, the costuming and the looks. But on one of the dance numbers, I wanted to quickly bring this up before we run out of time. that on Mars, there's a giant set of like a big deity, like he calls it.
Oh my god!
Um,
Yeah, the idol.
the idol.
Yeah.
That's the one joke that actually in Mars that really made me chuckle. He says, "Oh, it's an idol. He's an idol." He says, "What with all these women about?" And I was like, "That's a funny joke." But there's this massive idol, and they're dancing around it. But it has these arms that move,
Mm-hmm.
and then it picks up these women in sort of sweeps them up and this thing. And I was like, that for 1930 and that sort of, I mean, I don't know how dangerous it was. I'm sure people got caught their leg or something, but like, it's really impressive. Like, it's a really good set piece.
That is Bugsley Berkeley, right? I mean, there's a famous Bugsley Berkeley number where I think it's a sort of staircase that's winding, and it's expanding as it goes up, and he would build these sets that would just spin around and change and open up as people danced on them. And I thought that was doing that thing that I like so much about Berkeley's work, but also in that kind of sci-fi setting, right? And the idol looks cool. I mean, it
really does.
It's just amazing to watch. You can imagine seeing this on the big screen,
Yeah.
especially in an era where, before color, where, this would have been just, I mean, it's a shame this was a flop because we could have had another 30 years of big budget sci-fi stuff that we never got.
Yeah.
But also, like, I would have been blown away by this.
Yeah, no, there's stuff, and this is only, I'm watching this on YouTube, and the quality's not great. And stuff, but like, there's some of these set pieces are really good. Like, this is the kind of film that I'm surprised hasn't got some obscure sort of like Criterion Collection clean-up version that they've re-released.
I think it deserves it. I mean, I think it's amazing. I mean, I like that you brought up that idol scene, but again, this is like that sense of spectacle, and I love that spectacle. And one of the criticisms of Berkeley, Bugsley Berkeley, is that he, sometimes those Berkeley numbers that he used to come in and direct for other directors, right? He would direct that number. Sometimes it's like, how does this fit into the film again? Like,
stop, dance number, carry on.
Or an amazing dance number that's sort of hallucinogenic and tons of mirrors and all of this wonderful stuff, people bursting through the screen and just astounding stuff even today. And then it's like, right, back to our story about the college kids, It's like so abrupt. But that idol scene is such a fantastic number. And I do think that, I mean, you were pointing out the way in which these are interlaced sort of plots that don't necessarily go together. This is sort of the dumb, big budget sci-fi of 1930. You and I like and have watched a lot of dumb, big budget sci-fi where it's like, oh, that looks awesome. These are good ideas, but I'm not sure this all went together. And why did you have to put Rob Schneider in it?
Yeah. Oh my God. Is this a Michael Bay film of 1930? But you're right. I think you're right about the spectacle. Excuse me, and it works. But the one thing I'd say is about talking about Ed Brindle and sort of Single-O coming in as a character. They raise him up bit by bit. Like, they keep giving him these little set pieces, and they keep sort of like bringing him on screen. I kind of like the hat thing of telling that story of going to the wedding, but you see, but because it is this story. Like, the story he tells with the hats is literally the story that the plot of this film of J 21 and Ellen. And so I kind of like that. But by the end of the film, he is the main character. Like, he saves the two, drags them off to the ship. He beats the sort of the big bad guy in some sort of weird vaudevillian thing. They find that their earlobes are a pressure point, which is interesting.
Why not?
He gets on the ship, and then he gets the rocket, fires it off from Mars to get it back home in time. So he also gets the final, they resolve the appeal, and J21 and Ellen are allowed to get together and sort of a bit like quick. But then Single-O is given the last shot of the film,
Yeah,
it's quite
that's right.
clear who the sort of the main character is. And I thought that was quite interesting by the end of the film. Like they've shifted to this character being the main character.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, he certainly, it felt to me like they're trying to give him something to do besides
Yes.
just get drunk on alcohol pills.
Yeah.
Um, and so yeah, they're trying to make him sort of be the hero. I mean, he's the one they're coming to see, so
Mm.
let's do that. I do think it's worth noting that in that court appearance, again, the set design's wonderful. I mean, and of course, it's silly to imagine Art Deco, it's like still going on, but it still looks amazing.
Yeah.
I love that courtroom with the judge high on the
Yeah.
bench and everything. But it is worth pointing out that Single O has brought back a Martian
Yes.
as a prisoner with that, reminds me of the Vulcan nerve pinch,
Mhm.
the from later. But and it did uncomfortably remind me of sort of Native Americans brought to the English court, and it's like, rightio, we can prove that we went to America because see, we brought one back with us.
That we haven't sort of we're running low on time, but that was
Yeah.
one of the things I was curious about, because the depiction of the Martians, the sets on Mars, feels very much like, and I'm going to be very careful with some of the words, but that sort of like early, almost like Victorian sort of like depictions of Africa. Here's the African vibe, umbo boogie, all that umbo boogie, that bone through the nose, all that kind of horrible stereotyping that happened. And then it does seem to feel like it transitions towards almost like depictions of Native Americans. Like they're going for that sort of savage, kind of thing. And it's interesting that it's conflicted because they have a queen and they're all nice and this other stuff, but there's still that element of like, well, they're not as advanced as us, kind of thing.
Right. Well, and also, I mean, both. Look, Africans were brought before the crown too.
Oh yeah.
But there is this trope of other spaces, right? Colonized spaces of noble savages, quote unquote, can be matriarchal.
Mm-hmm.
And but we here in civilized, England, we know the proper way, and all of this stuff. But there is a sort of like cultural space that's allowed to do that.
Yeah, no, it is an interesting thing, but we are coming to a close. So let's sort of resolve with our sort of final thoughts. So, Julian, just imagine. Do you have any final thoughts?
I mean, I kind of love this movie. I mean, I think the spectacle holds up. I think the miniatures, the special effects really hold up. It is. Look, I mean, it's more coherent, a sort of silly spectacle sci-fi story than a lot of stuff. And finally, I want to say that the as silly as these names are, I do like the sort of LN, but as silly as these names are, it reminded me of C3PO and R2D2, and let us not forget Obi-Wan.
Yeah.
Who, the people thought, oh, well, maybe he's secretly a droid or one of those clones from the Clone Wars, because it sounds like OB-1. So,
I'm glad
maybe there's more influence for this film than we would sometimes think.
I'm glad you said that. I almost made a space mech joke earlier. I thought, no, I'll leave it. I'm glad you made that connection. But so you enjoyed this film.
Yeah, I really like this film.
Yeah. It was fun to go back to. No, I won't. I refuse. I'm not going to sort of diss on this film. I went back and I was within 10 minutes. I think one of the things I'd say is I was impressed with the pace. I was like, this film's is what I would say, 10 minutes of the film starting. Like you've got to get through those opening credits because it's like the old films where the entire credits are at the beginning. But you're right. This film moves at a hell of a pace. There's a lot going on. There's a lot to see. Remembering this is in 1930, it's chock full of ideas at times. Not all the jokes land. I think they've aged out. We've seen better versions of them. and even a lot of the vaudeville kind of sort of humor is done better elsewhere. However, there is a real charm to this film, and I kind of like some of the musical numbers. I do kind of like the Fly Swat song. The drinking one was good. The dance performances at the end and Mars are good. I was surprised that sort of I got to the end of this and I was like, I didn't hate that. Like I enjoyed that. That was good. Like I've never heard of this film, but I think I got something from it. So I don't think I'll ever go back and watch it. I don't think it's something I'll seek out again. But I'm glad I've seen this sort of like early swing for the fences. And we often say that we like that kind of thing, but this early swing for the fences of like, yeah, let's try something a bit crazy and see what happens. And this mixture of sort of like this sort of like mix up of everything, doesn't always work in its running time, but it's fun. Let's talk about you say actually good point. Sorry, I just want to hit on this. You've just said about space mechs and George Lucas, right? Obi-Wan. Don't forget, in this season we are going to be talking about THX-38.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to talk about? I think you're right. George Lucas has seen and enjoys this film.
Yeah, and the other thing is that spaceship. I mean, I know I've commented on a lot and we're out of time, but that shot of the moon, the shots of Earth from outer space,
yes,
are cool. I mean, there should be more cloud cover and stuff, but it's funny how they say nobody's seen this before. So clearly, there's never been. It's just like our first trip into outer space. It's like, screw the moon, we're going straight to Mars.
Yeah.
So I mean, it doesn't make sense, but I like when he looks through the telescope at Earth and sees his beloved's face. Sort of singing the love song about the melody and the words. I did find that quite charming. But that rocket ship was used in the Flash Gordon serials. And those sci-fi serials, which really start around this time and are the only sci-fi in major budget sci-fi for quite some time, is where Star Wars comes out of. So.
Exactly. Yeah. And also, don't forget, 50 years from this point, 1980, that rocket would be replicated for Flash Gordon.
Yeah.
So if you were to transpose the director of this, David Butler, would be like, well, where does we go with science fiction? I'd be like, well, here's a film from 1980, and I would show him Flash Gordon. And he'd be like, oh, wow, we haven't moved on much at all. But yes, anyway, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to season 4 of Stories Out of Time and Space. This is it. We've just been covered. Just Imagine from 1930. There is a link, and I'll make sure it's in the notes. There's a link down to the YouTube, or a YouTube version of this. It's readily available. Just so you know, it's mostly fine. I think I found there's a couple of jump edits that sort of like where footage may have lost, but it's literal seconds. And it looks fine throughout. Other than that, I hope you've enjoyed this. And if you do enjoy this, don't forget to go back, check out the episodes we've done before, the 3 of the seasons where we've covered tens of films. Red Dwarf, Westworld, recently we've done Doctor Who, and go check out our Patreon. As Julian said, we are talking our way through the Twilight Zone, episode by episode, and there's a couple of extra bonuses on there where we covered the Doctor Who, the movie from 1995, and the comic relief special, The Curse of the Fatal Death. So go check those out. There'll be a link down to our Patreon down below. But aside from that, Julian, thank you very much for letting me imagine. This has been a wonderful experience.
Well, you remember those old ads from DC Comics, in the 90s? Just imagine,
Yes.
all the heroes united. So next up is Dr. Cyclops from 1940. Yeah,
we jump in 10 years. Yeah, let's see what the 40s have to offer for us. I don't think there's any musical numbers in that. We shall find out. But ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, and we shall talk to you again soon.
There's something very important I forgot to tell you.
What?
Don't cross the streams.